Hey everybody, this is Kit Merker here from Noble 9, and I'm with Sarah Murphy. She is an SRE, Site Reliability Engineer.
Greetings, Kit. How are you today?
Doing great, great to see you. Well, we were chatting before, and I wanted to jump kind of right into it. You were a reliability engineer, a release engineer at Facebook and at Google, and I
Yeah.
have this question, which is what's the difference between reliability engineering or production engineering between the two companies? Can you maybe share, contrast the two?
One, I think the Google model is very familiar to people, mostly because of the 3+ books that have been put out there. There's a lot of chats. There's been relatively little that has come from Facebook about this, like how this might work. My understanding of it was, while there was originally, say maybe pre-2008, 2009, an attempt to do more formal SRE stuff at Facebook, it moved on to an app ops and production engineering, these titles, where the folks who are most focused on the production environment and its infrastructure engineering moved very close to the teams, right? And we're really empowered to kind of like push those teams forward and act a little bit as supervision on the infrastructure side, right? So folks might be going, hey, we don't have enough resources for this, or we're noticing the following patterns of instability. Let me help you solve that. But what it wasn't was almost a dedicated practice group the way that it is in Google, or a group of folks who are on call who had the ability to just say, oh no, we have an error budget, you've exceeded that, we've got to stop it for the following reasons, right? So Facebook broke that model, and I was, a tiny part of that, little cog in it as a release engineer, because of the way that Facebook competed, especially at the time that I was there. This is pre-IPO and very much competing for like by feature. Launch, 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 launch. This is the lockdown era, like 90 days to ship a year's worth of features, that kind of stuff. So the idea that stability came first was like a later adaptation based on like change in how first it was move fast and break things. Move fast while remaining stable infrastructure. That happened later, right? It took a while to evolve. So the idea, of the people who had the actual like press the no button, like it was very small. Like I never blocked a feature when I was a Facebook release engineer. Instead, my job was to figure out what was required in order to reduce the risk of launching it. So it was more like air traffic control than it was like a super segmented release process.
One of the things I take from this contrast is that there still is a need to measure, and there's still a need for sort of balance, right? You still need to be aware and maybe make an eyes wide open decision about risk management. So maybe what's the methodology, or how would you look at the measurement piece of it?
Yeah, great question, because it wasn't just flying blind, right? Like that. So some of the things that were put up for safety mechanisms were, for instance, so one, the advantage of Facebook, especially its web interface at the time, was that everyone in the company was using it for their business almost every second that they were working. So even a relatively small bug would get hundreds of users interacting with it. And that, I think, is an advantage that came, that really bore its light compared to, say, something like, and I went to Google after this, or returned to Google after this, compared to, say, something like Google+, which was used by relatively few people internally, right? Facebook Business, that offering, was originally Facebook's like how it ran, right? So how we talked to each other, how we did a lot of document sharing and things like that. So if the like button was broken or somebody couldn't put a picture up, we saw it within minutes. And a continuous shipment from trunk was happening. Like as soon as it could build, it was going to an internal version. So that was our first worry. We also had our first alert. We also had a stepped release process where this went out, I think you might have seen the meme, like, I don't test, but when I do, I test in prod, that meme, right? And I don't know if you can show that on the video or something. But the method that was, this kind of doctrine, which I think has spread throughout the industry now, was certainly in use in Facebook at the time, if not developed there, by Chuck Rossi, who was the first release engineer. We test in prod, right? We can't get around it. Like emergent errors at scale only appear in production, and then you try to it's a lot to pick apart here. So instead it's like, well, guess what? We're going to ship to 1% of active users. Well, 1% of active users will surface even at the time with a smaller, i.e. only 5 to 800 million users, that will surface hundreds of thousands of, say, PHP null pointer exceptions within seconds, right? And so you're going to see even something that might not seem to be an egregious error will be touched by a bunch of users, and you'll see that variance immediately. And then we had really good ways to just roll it back. Now, this was at the time was a very, and I'm speaking of a while ago, a very manual process, and I'm sure it has improved. Fingers crossed, whoever's sitting in front of the button right now. But I had a lot of time of like watching graphs, watching this kind of thing, looking for variance and attempting to determine whether there's a disturbance in the force, right? So it was more of like, we had a very small testing team, like 3 or 4 people who would do manual checks. But really it was just like, well, we're going to put it out in front of everybody. They might see a little shakiness, the notorious like Tuesday full release kind of thing. And then we also had another way of segmenting change. We would see these errors right away. And then just we're very much focused on how quickly can we return to a previously known good version.
Other companies looking at this, you know, if they maybe don't have the scale of Facebook, they
Sure.
two challenges there. One is, you know, 1% of traffic might be a very small number. And second, you may not be able to dog food quite at the, or, you know, have internal use at the same level.
Yeah.
So how would you, if you didn't have those advantages, you probably would design a different system, or how would you think about that?
I certainly am not in favor of designing systems that largely depend on a single or small number of engineers' vigilance, right? Like this is not something that the Valley really recruits for well, and it's not a technical skill. It's like almost an interpersonal or experiential skill. So it's like, what are you going to, you know, you look for people who have been bothered enough in other fields, and then, you know, but so yeah, I mean, it is a real problem. Some of this is just more of the basics, like, hey, you should like care about having tests. Well, that's great, but even for smaller companies or ones that maybe like B2B systems that don't have that level of throughput on users, now it becomes more the discussion of what a modern observability platform is. Like, do you have the ability to do distributed tracing, right? Do you have enough history left in your logs, possibly through sampling, so that you can see an emergent and more insidious error that might have not been important, but you need to know that it happened 4 days ago? Do you have like a single point of truth for what's going on in production, like a production change log? Or, I mean, there's a lot of systems like this, so that you can tell, hey, well, what changed 2 days ago and who did it and why? And I think when you think of it in more of a capability model, you'll start seeing these pieces are missing. And then it's like, well, now we are still testing in prod, tough noogies, right? But we also don't know what's going on with the system, period. You know, so now it's just, you're in the worst place from an SRE or reliability infrastructure standpoint, where you're like, we don't know what's broken until our customers tell us. And so that's a big problem.
Business stakeholders who are thinking about customers and customer experience, you got these engineers who are thinking about, you know, actually making it work. In my experience, I've seen conflict arise from those two groups of people talking. Have you ever seen that, or how do you handle that?
You know, I hope it wouldn't. So it's an interesting question. Like, is there necessarily a split between, I mean, you can create a culture that's like that, or you can suddenly find yourself in a culture. And so I view it more as a cultural problem, is like, well, I want to have, you know, ideally unity between kind of like the mission orientation, right? It is clear what our customers want, or at least how the company is making money. And then, you know, engineers are really good to optimizing at 1 or 2 things. So hopefully they're optimizing toward that. I think when it's not clear, and also, you know, some of these basics would be like, well, do you have OKRs or anything that rhymes like that? Like, how are you orienting? How quickly you're able to do it? And then have the iteration of the product. I mean, that's the advantage of things like a lot of products at Google, Facebook. I mean, I can point at those 2 companies. Could be Microsoft. Could be a lot of places doing similar things. But I don't think that there needs to be a business split, and I usually get worried when there is. It could be a good idea, but perhaps it is time, you know, a lot of people have good ideas. A lot of people can be charged to implement those ideas, right? And this could be, I'll give you an example of something where it was like, it was probably an appropriate idea, but at the wrong time. So a lot of people have ideas. A lot of people might even have contributions of code or other kind of things, but not everyone is responsible for the results. So an example, and since we're talking about Facebook, was like I got called about something that was a change to like an experiment running an ad serving on Super Bowl Sunday. I didn't know who this was. Not only that, I didn't know who their boss was. And I was the one that kind of the sysadmin said call because I was on, I basically put a block on all production changes during that time. And I was the one who was on call. And it escalated also up to Rossi, but we ended up at the point of like, we don't know you. You can't, like, it's not your job to be responsible for it, yet it's ours. So we're gonna make the call and this will roll out Monday. Just on the general principle of like, well, you don't make extremely risky changes when no one's around to pay attention to them in our prime time. And you see echoes of this in other places when folks have like production freezes before Christmas or something like that, or before a Thanksgiving holiday season. So that's kind of how I view it, is like, yeah, this is great, but eventually it's not so much buck stops here. It's like there are people knowledgeable and responsible and you need to trust them.
Your point is also that there's an awareness of the business logic of what's going on, right? It's not engineering in sort of a vacuum, right? It's aware of the context.
I have been fortunate in that most places I have worked, I have not been in the dark as to what the business case was. And even breaking this up, and I'll break into some, Chuckerisms right here, kind of like taking a little bit of his chapter and verse, like, these kind of things, like, well, what's broken? How long has it been broken? Why do I need to fix it right now? And how important is it? And so certainly, I've had at all kind of places, like quite willing to throw in extra hours, quote overtime or whatever, or like try to figure out more delicate mitigations of risk. If somebody says, well, yeah, it's $20 million. Well, okay, great, this is awesome. And in other cases, some of these large scale companies, a little different for smaller ones, but you could have something where it'd be like, well, this is a launch that affects 3% of books users in Bulgaria. Well, hold on a second. I think that might be able to wait until we get adequate support and I can manage the risk. I like it when it's just that bullet, like, well, you tell me what's going on. And often when things are poorly thought out, they really can't get, people can't advocate beyond this first or second question, right? And then you start digging into, I think, what are more substantial engineering questions, like, well, how am I going to roll it back because stuff breaks, right? Unfortunately, especially in this time, as much as I'd love, given pandemic or whatever, love to be super optimistic, optimism is not generally part of my job description, like more realism or assuming that things go wrong. And then the magic is not me being a hero and fixing it. It's that, oh, I've anticipated that something might go wrong and I have some kind of operational capacity to deal with it.
You mentioned before we turn the camera on here, we were talking about recruiting tech, and you have some experience working in recruiting. I know a lot of people right now are kind of on the hunt for jobs, and remote job search is, including yourself, yes. And the remote job search is definitely different. I thought maybe you could share a little of your perspective on how that could work or should work.
Ooh, I think it might be a little premature to say should work, except like, hey, you all should hire me. But aside from that, yeah, I think it is very different, and in good and bad ways. So one, because, just the idea. I think I even have my mom occasionally ask me about this. Oh, so when you get a job, you're going to go back to the office. And I'm like, no. Certainly the response by a lot of these majors, or a lot of the more generally famous companies, right? So when you see things like Twitter, Slack say remote first, don't, Facebook, hey, don't necessarily come back. Google, Microsoft, I think Amazon as well, saying, yeah, summer 2021, cross your fingers kind of thing. And so my take on it, and now over the last few weeks, really like been doubling down on this, like now I'm talking to you from a new standing desk and things like that, is this is my office probably for the next year or something like this, right? We now have an alignment of the training environment, right? For how you're going to learn stuff, the interview environment for how it's going to be evaluated, and the job environment for when you get the job. It's here we are. You are not going to be in a primary colored wonderland, right? Like Google, which originally, made a lot of stuff seem like Stanford, or even, possibly positive for some people, an open office bullpen, right? So now it's just here. It's me and my swords. There we go, and that has some downsides as well, right? It is exhausting to do, like panel interviews, very much a part of the Valley, right? Like come in all day, hope you can stand up in front of a whiteboard and all that other kind of stuff. Well, I don't have to do that, but I do find myself doing, almost interviews like this are the easy part. Like doing live coding, I had not done that. Live coding on a shared screen is a performance. And I am figuring it out, like to, because it sometimes feels a little embarrassing, on a coding challenge, for instance, where I had one this morning, coding challenge, where go ahead and use anything because it's just like our job, right? We do use Google, et cetera. Or all these kind of Stack Overflow, all these other kind of resources. But it just seems like, oh, wait, should I have all this memorized? I don't during my job, but okay. And then putting it together and then having to almost like, well, I can't just stare at documentation for 10 minutes. So it's a new set of skills for interviewing, and they're not the same. So that is a little bit of like, oh, okay. Also, I find that a lot of jobs that might be high trust are difficult, I think, for companies to interview for. So senior staff positions, especially when you're expecting people to have a significant amount of latitude, I think folks might be a little gun shy as to filling those with people they haven't met. This was back in March as COVID was rolling in. Literally, I think a few days before the official Northern California counties lockdown. It was a position that I was really flattered to be considered for. It's like a principal SRE position, but it was described as, well, you're not going to have a team, but you are going to, we want you to inspire people. We want to evangelize. You're going to like share projects, get excited, and all this stuff. And I went, what? I don't know if I can do that remotely. It seems like a tall order. And they were like, oh no, it's going to be fine. We're going to be back in the office by mid-April. I wish. I had to turn it, there's more to that story I'll pass on, but I had to turn it down just because I didn't think it could be done remotely. They ended up connecting me, and I was asking, hey, show me somebody who has, and they connected me with like engineer number one who'd been there for 11 years. I'm like, this is great, and I'm honored to speak with you, but I can't replicate that experience. So I think there's a lot of stuff where companies have had to try to figure out how they're going to evaluate people, what's really possible. And I think now with this 4 to 5 month experience, depending on what part of the country you're in, I think the companies have really started to see like, well, is it 100% productivity, 60 depends on individuals, where they at, and things like that.
What are you doing to keep sharp? What are you doing to stay connected to people? Is there anything any thoughts on that? Any advice you have? Anything that's working great for you to stay connected to people as we're all remote?
The kind of kin keeping is a big thing now, right? Because I think it's very easy for everyone to get isolated. So what I've done in this way is, I set up a couple peer study groups, right? I wanted it to be less overhead and also less demanding than doing formal instruction, right? So I'm not setting myself aside to be like the expert on Python, but then I just set up a group and said, told people, friends and family and acquaintances, like, if you want to join me, please join me, and we'll kind of monitor each other, right? So like I set up a Slack channel. Hey, every week for 6 weeks, we're going to meet for an hour or an hour and a half. We can chat about things. We can challenge each other. And I was like, I'll do code reviews for you, whatever, we'll try our best, right? I need to speed up my knowledge and spin up my knowledge. And you might be brand new or an experienced programmer, or maybe you're coming from another language, let's work together. So that worked very well. Currently doing one with Go as I focus on that a little more over the last couple of weeks, and slightly different audiences, like different participants. But no, it's been good. If you're not having a great time studying by yourself, and then you're having difficulties doing the interviews, the work is not going to be easier, because now we know that that environment is not going to change. So I've found some of this, I'm experimenting with it, is the idea of like, oh, yeah, I talked about code to other people remotely. In some cases, people I haven't talked to in years. In other cases, folks I might not have met in person ever. That seemed to be a good method, a good addition to just the purely technical, hey, this is how you do something in this language.
There's a certain amount of sort of solidarity to it, and people who are like-minded, and maybe it's even a way. I mean, when I think about the upside of the pandemic and the situation, leveling the playing field across geographic locations and pushing people to connect in ways that they may not have otherwise, I think is, at least looking a little bit at the silver lining.
If someone's doing a peer study group, I think it is very much like the way one would learn at a large tech company, where it's like, go read the docs, here's maybe a project, go work it out, but you reach out to me after you've made like hours worth of effort, when you really get stuck. And I don't know if that's something that works for a lot of people, because they might be expecting something that's very, a long time ago, I used to be a in-classroom technical instructor. And that's more of the kind of thing of like, oh yeah, I got a problem, the 5-minute break, right? Like, it's a little slow, I don't quite understand, can you explain this to me? And you're not getting that rapid feedback. Instead, it's great, like, oh, we're asynchronous, great, send me a code review and I'll comment on your code. Or, oh yeah, I finally just checked Slack and I see this problem here, read this link, very much more hands-off. Or, hey, let's do pair programming after you've already put a lot of time in, right? So it's more equivalent, an equivalent engagement, whereas it's very different from in person. So, or something where it'd be like, yeah, I'm running a class and I charge you money and I'm downloading the knowledge from my brain or whatever magic happens. Like, no, it's not that. On the plus side, the way I think about this is, cyberpunk future, for better or worse, that I dreamed about when I was 16 is here. You can learn everything for almost free. I can pick one of these languages. You, of course, must have seen this through a lot of technical things, technical subjects out there where it's like, and this being one example, there's hundreds of videos being uploaded per week on certain core technical subjects. It's, hey, Harvard C50X class is available for free. Like, well, I don't teach at Harvard, so how am I going to beat that? Go watch it. All right.
The interesting thing about a point you made is it's kind of like how you learn when you work in a big tech company. And I think this is a very interesting point, because if people are on the job hunt, they may not have that experience or understand kind of what that's. So rather than taking the sort of interview prep directly, where it's like, let me learn how to sort of pass the test, taking a different approach, which is to try to, in some ways, recreate the environment you'd be entering.
The best thing that people can do, and I'm stealing this from an idea from a former coworker, John Doak, the best thing that people can do for this kind of stuff is to show up with a project that they're interested in advance. So at a company, of course, you'd be assigned to a team, and your team has whether you're burning down bugs or there's a core product, and that's where your motivation and focus is going to come from. It works or it doesn't. We get more users or it don't. Your code was able to be deployed or it is not, and you can have that focus and then see an operating system. So either bring your own project to this, or you'd be probably like a moderate size open source system where you're trying to like understand it and maybe add things to it. Or, ideally, A peer study group would be a group of people all working on the same problem. And then you'd have something that very much paralleled what was at a tech company, right? Of course, the downside is you're not getting paid, but on the upside, you didn't go through a filter to get into the project.
For the hundreds of hiring managers out there,
Yeah.
what would your perfect job look like that you're looking for right now?
A lot of things that I might have thought about as part of my perfect job have really been set aside by events. So now I'm boiling it down into, to kind of riff on the other things we've talked about. I'm boiling it down to one, the job has to be able to be done remotely. And it's not because I'm like, yes, I want to work remotely forever, but just literally the health department is not going to let you into your office. And you probably can't afford to run your office at 40% occupancy in the Bay Area where I live. So can it be really done remotely? Two, is it clear what the mission orientation of your product or your company is? Are you going to be able to explain to me as a remote worker without the ability to do that kind of cultural indoctrination that a company had? So can you tell me what's important, where the money comes from, and what you're trying to do so that I can execute on that vision remotely without having a lot of sync conversations? So those are the two top things. The other thing is, hey, I'd love to, I've written a lot of like archaeological code is how I put it, like digging into existing systems and trying to load it all in my brain, or endless amounts of cloud provider in either private or consumer, and trying to figuring out like, well, what 10 lines do I need to change what 20 lines? So if I can do like more coherent coding without being like a full out software developer, which I'm not, that would be awesome, especially in Go, just because I'm focused on that lately. But yeah, we're in weird times. If somebody says, hey, I can just think of all these things that used to be so prevalent in the Valley, and I, of course, have really taken advantage of the privilege of them for years. Doesn't matter if you have a cafeteria now. Not going to eat next to my coworkers until there's a vaccine. I don't want your box chicken for lunch. No, thank you. I'm going to have to trust that you pay me enough for me to eat my own food and I can cook. So awesome. I don't happen to have a pet, but if I did, I guess I would have a dog-friendly office. I don't care about your dog-friendly office. There's a Spaceship X wind tunnel demo hanging, or was hanging above like building, well, like 41 or something, 40, 41, and could get those numbers wrong at Google. Like, it's immaterial now. I got sorts. So like, I wish there was a lot of cool things, but eventually it comes down to, can I do your job remotely? Are you oriented to deal with this type of pandemic? I don't know. If you have Iron Man power armor, I will totally work on that for like cheap, right? As long as I get a suit. But otherwise, what are we gonna do, SRE is a lot of plumbing. I want to be excited about the product, of course, but it's like significantly secondary to now, can the work be done in the environment that we are going to be in for the next 12 to 18 months?
Sarah, it was an absolute pleasure talking today. Thank you so much.
It was a blast. Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me discourse / just rant about some of my ideas. I hope they're helpful for people out there, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Everybody out there, this is Kip Merker from Noble9 signing off.